Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of EB-5 Essentials. In today's episode, we will talk about what is driving EB-5 demand across Africa and the MENA region, what investors should expect in real-life timelines and consular processing, what has changed under the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act, and why infrastructure projects are becoming an important category for long-term planning. My name is Akshat Gupta. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for India and the UAE at US Immigration Fund. USIF is an experienced US EB-5 regional center that has helped over 6,000 EB-5 investors and their families obtain green card through the EB-5 visa program. Our first guest for the day is my dear friend Moussa, Vice President of Business Development for MENA at US Immigration Fund. Moussa has over a decade of experience in the EB-5 industry and leads the investor relations across Middle East and Africa. Thank you so much, Moussa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our next guest is Ms. Majidi, also known as Nofi. Nofi is a director at Fragment's worldwide private client practice, bringing over 11 years of experience advising ultra-high net worth individuals and families across the Middle East and Africa on residence and citizenship planning. She specializes in strategic global mobility solutions, working closely with private clients, family offices, and intermediaries to design long-term immigration, contingency, and optionality strategies aligned with complex personal and business objectives. Thank you so much for joining us, Nofi.
It is an absolute pleasure to be here.
Our next guest for the day is Ms. Isha Atassi, partner at Fragment. Isha has nearly 20 years of experience practicing U.S. immigration law and advises both corporate and individual clients with a strong focus on compliance, risk management, and practical strategy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Aisha, for joining us virtually. We hope to do our next podcast with you in person. But thank you so much for joining us virtually today. It's a pleasure to have you all. And without further ado, let's move into segment one for the day. Nofi, are there any specific investor or family profiles from this region that are a good fit for EB-5 from a legal and planning perspective?
Well, the best EB-5 candidates from Africa and MENA aren't really defined by net worth alone, but they're really defined by structure, patience, and planning discipline. In Africa, the strongest fit typically seems to be the second-generation entrepreneurs, real estate developers, industrialists, and agribusiness professionals.
How does typically EB-5 compare to other visa programs when considered by people from this region?
Well, these investors are often asset-rich but cash flow complex, which makes early legal structuring very critical. When done right, they're excellent EB-5 candidates. In the GCC, we often see that family offices or senior professionals with cleaner liquidity, but more often complex cross-border holdings. These investors tend to be very process-oriented and value predictable, which often aligns with post-RIA EB-5, provided expectations are set correctly.
Musa, coming to you, which countries and investor profiles from this region are most interested in EB-5, and what's probably their main consideration when it comes to looking at EB-5?
It's hard to pinpoint specific countries and say that these are the countries that are really interested in the EB-5, but I would say the English-speaking countries are the most who are interested in EB-5 because they are already going to a country that speak the language that they do speak. You can talk about Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa. And when we talk about the Middle East, you have Egypt, who is the third largest market in Africa after Nigeria and South Africa. And in the Middle East also, you have countries especially like Bahrain. And I'm surprised enough that I was able to get an investor from Oman, who is actually an Omani citizen. So it's difficult to pinpoint specific countries, but I would say English-speaking countries are mostly the ones who are more leaning towards the EB-5.
Sure. So in our podcast today, there are obviously going to be people who are going to know about EB-5 for the first time, Musa. For the interest of those people, how can we define the EB-5 visa program for them in a very brief manner? And what is EB-5 from an at-risk visa perspective?
So EB-5, to dumb it down, is a program that will allow you, your spouse, and your kids under 21 to get the United States residency. You need to make an investment of $800,000, and getting the U.S. residency will also allow you to get the U.S. citizenship after 5 years of residency if you qualify for it. The qualification for citizenship is not complicated, but we're not getting into that. When we are talking about also reason why people are doing the EB-5, was that your question, your second part of your question?
So the first part is how do we divide or how do we talk about EB-5 from a very brief perspective, and how do we define an at-risk investment of the nature of EB-5?
So in the rules of the EB-5, there is a at-risk requirement, but it doesn't mean that the investment must be risky.
Yeah.
You are not just putting your money into something to lose it. Your goal is to make sure that your investment is safe. So for that, you have to work with partners that you know are really oriented towards the safety of your investment. Regional center that know what they're doing. Look at the track record, see what they have done in the past, and work with experts such as Fragment. They are the largest immigration law firm in the world. So there's a reason why Fragment is here till today. So they are really they are really thorough when it comes to the source of funds, the origin of the capital, the pathway, and they would only work with partners that they know will make sure that the investment is going to be successful.
So Moussa, you've obviously worked with investors from this region for over a decade. In your experience of over a decade, what are primarily the main questions that are asked by such investors? And what is primarily the main consideration for them when they look at the EB-5 visa program?
Safety of investment. That's really important. I have worked with over 100 Nigerians. Nigeria has been my biggest market in Africa. And the main question that you get most of the time is, how safe is my investment? Am I going to get my money back? I mean, most of the Nigerians, if you are familiar with them, they are savvy business people. They will look at the documents and they will ask the proper questions. And they usually have a team dedicated to help them because they are business owners most of the time. And they have experience in business. So some will ask you about return on investment, but the safety of investment is very important.
Sure. And in your experience, have majority cases been of consular processing, or has it, because that's something that we're going to talk about in our next segment, but have there mostly been people who are completely migrating to the US, or you've also come across cases where people are already in the US and they're probably doing it for their kids, and so on and so forth?
So it's a bit of both. You have parents who are business owners who are back home, and sometimes they know that they will not be able to qualify within the timeline that is required to maintain a residency in the US. So for that reason, they would do it under the name of the spouse. So the spouse will be the primary applicant and the kids will benefit from it. But in other instances also, you have kids who are in the US. I've had clients who made investment just for their kids, but were not part of the investment. Just the kids in the US were the one who did the investment separately. In certain cases, I remember I have a client who did 2 investments for his 2 kids. One was doing a petroleum engineering in University of Oklahoma, and his daughter was going for medical school. So he made 2 investments for his 2 kids.
Thank you, Nofi. Thank you, Moussa. I think this definitely gives a clear answer in terms of the investor profiles from this region. Moving on to our next segment, let's discuss about the processing timelines involved for those investors who are looking at consular processing, while the visa bulletin shows current. This is for you, Nofi. How does typically EB-5 looked at as compared to other visa programs for investors from this region?
Well, in client conversations, EB-5 isn't competing on speed, it's competing on outcome. So African and MENA investors almost always evaluate EB-5 alongside E2, whether that's for Caribbean CBI programs and European golden visas, for instance. The speed, the travel, and the access. Golden visas typically offer that front, whether it's regional mobility, E2 business flexibility, it really delivers what the EB-5 does, whether that's going to be permanent U.S. residence for the entire family without operational dependence. That said, EB-5 has higher friction, capital commitment, documentation depth, and longer timelines. Sophisticated investors, in my opinion, understand this and often pair the EB-5 with interim solutions such as an E2 or a citizenship by investment program. So while the EB-5 runs its course, what we think about is post-IRA, EB-5 has become less of a maybe product and more of a commitment decision. So as a result, conversations are strongest amongst families who are ready to understand the value of what the EB-5 does. Its permanence, but not the convenience.
Hi, Aisha. Thank you firstly for joining us again from New York, a city that I really like. This question is for you. While EB-5 categories for investors from this region continue to be current, what in your experience are processing timelines looking like?
So EB-5 timing is shaped by project category, country of birth, and of course, filing volume. And fortunately for investors born in the African and MENA regions, the demand pressure is not as high as, for example, Indian or Chinese born nationals. So EB-5 category appears as quote unquote current. And this coupled with the fact that we're seeing some pretty quick approval timelines of EB-5 cases as compared to more traditional paths for a green card like employment or family sponsorship makes it a really attractive option, particularly for investors from the Middle East and Africa regions. But what exactly does current mean, right? It means that there's no backlog or delay in progressing with the green card application. So to obtain the conditional green card through the EB-5 path, there are two steps. And the first one is filing the EB-5 petition, what we call an I-526. And then the second path is filing the adjustment of status application if you're in the United States, or an immigrant visa if you are abroad, and that's filed with the US consulate. So for some nationalities, progressing to that next step can take many years. They need to wait for the visa to become available to them. But that's not the case right now for MENA and African-born investors. So they can progress to this next stage without delay. In the US, in fact, if they happen to be here in a lawful status, it means that they can concurrently file an adjustment of status along with the EB-5 petition, and that allows them to get interim work and travel benefits, and so it's a very significant advantage. But again, current on the visa bulletin doesn't automatically mean fast. So what do processing times look like, right? Processing steps and timelines vary, and everything needs to be really carefully planned, particularly for investors who are outside of the United States pursuing the consular processing route. Timelines are largely driven by interview availability at that specific consular post. That can vary pretty significantly. Abu Dhabi right now is pretty backlogged. And then in addition, there are security vettings and background checks that can disproportionately impact individuals from the region, and that can be a bit unpredictable in duration.
Yeah, you mentioned about, were you saying something?
I think just one other thing, if I might add, that's really important to discuss, and we'd sort of be remiss if we don't mention the travel bans, right? The travel bans largely impact the MENA and African regions, and there's been multiple iterations of it. And I think the most impactful one to our discussion is the suspension of immigrant visas. And that just became effective in late January. It applies across 75 different countries, and again, largely MENA and African impact. What it means is that the State Department has indefinitely suspended the issuance of immigrant visas while it reassesses its procedures to determine whether an applicant is likely to become a public charge. So you might be scratching your head and thinking, well, in the context of EB-5, we're talking about applicants who can very likely demonstrate through their financial status that they're not going to become a public charge or financially dependent on the US government. But Unfortunately, the suspension applies pretty broadly across all immigrant visa categories. And so we really need to monitor the situation. It's pretty fluid right now. But what it means in practice is you can still file your EB-5 petition. If it's approved, you can still be scheduled for an immigrant visa interview. It's just that the actual issuance of the visa is going to be delayed while the suspension is in place. So bottom line, current doesn't mean now, today, tomorrow. There are variances and nuances to navigate, important to work with your counsel and understand the timing expectations. And sometimes it's that last mile that can just take a little bit longer than expected.
Sure. Thank you so much for that detailed answer. Just a follow-up question on that. When USCIS looks at these 75 countries, if I am someone who belongs to these 75 countries, do I look at it from a perspective of country of birth, or do I look at it from a perspective of country of residence or citizenship?
Yeah, it's nationality. So it's not residence, it's controlled by country of birth. That said, if you are a dual national, so say you're from a country that's impacted like Egypt, but you're a dual national of, for example, the UK, which is not an impacted country, then it's possible to qualify and continue to process as normal underneath your UK passport. So again, an important thing to be considered as you're going through the process.
Sure. So I think the bottom line is consult an immigration attorney to get a professional answer on this. All right.
Absolutely.
Okay. You mentioned about something really important, which is processing timelines, right? Aisha, for someone like you who speaks to an investor today from this region, how can we define these processing timelines? What do they look like as of today?
Yeah. So putting the immigrant visa suspension aside, because that threw a little bit of a curveball in the processing times, but otherwise, on average in the region, start to finish is about 18 months. It's important to remember, of course, processing times are not guaranteed. They're subject to change, but on average, that's what we're currently seeing.
Okay. And what are the most common causes of friction or delay at the consulates for people from this region, in your experience?
I think we talked about the macro immigration landscape issues. On an individual investor level, I see three most common reasons for delay. The first is not having your documents ready in good order, right? So there could be difficulty obtaining civil documents such as a birth certificate. Perhaps the civil document doesn't exist in your country. It's important to prepare for alternative and secondary documents if that happens to be the case. I think another cause for friction or delay can sometimes be inconsistency in your name across multiple civil documents. We know naming conventions can vary. We know transliteration into English can vary. You could perhaps have a civil document that includes your grandfather's name, your father's name, your name, other civil documents that do not. Consistency is best, and in the absence of that, being able to explain the variance. We talked a little bit about what I would consider the second cause for delay, which is security checks, background checks. There's not much you can do to control that situation, and you just need to let it run its course. The third thing I see is not being prepared for your interview and anticipating the likely questions that could come up. We're seeing consulates more and more ask specific questions about the project that the investor invested in, the number of jobs that have been created. So even though that EB-5 petition has already been approved by the time you go for your interview, it's still important to be familiar with the project and the investment and anticipate those questions. None of these are roadblocks. They're all issues that can be navigated with proper preparation and counsel.
Really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Aisha. Nafi, coming to you, how should investors realistically plan around relocation, employment changes, or children's education, given these processing realities and some challenges at times?
The biggest planning mistake we see is treating EB-5 as a relocation timeline rather than a relocation range. So for African and MENA families, consular processing realities mean that you have to plan in phases, so no fixed dates, even when visa categories are technically current. Administrative processing, background checks, or local consular capacity can introduce months of variability, particularly in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and the Levant. The most successful families don't unwind their lives too early, but what they do is actually maintain their employment, their schooling, their residences at home while building what we call optionality. So for children's education, this often means selecting schools where flexibility intake periods are current. Online or hybrid models can be options, and often deferring U.S. enrollment until the visa is physically in hand. This is key. We've seen families incur unnecessary financial and emotional strain by committing too early to U.S. institutions before the visas are actually issued. Employment planning follows the same logic. Investors should actually avoid assuming immediate work authorization upon approval and instead structure professional transitions conservatively, especially for primary income earners. So what I would say my key takeaway is in this particular instance is that the EB-5 requires sequenced planning. Families who treat timelines as fluid and preserve flexibility often experience far smoother outcomes than those who actually plan around best-case scenarios.
Sure. Are there proactive steps that families can take in early so that they can minimize these delays or surprises during consular processing?
Yeah, so this is where experienced regional specific planning makes the biggest difference. The most effective step, I would say, is front-loading documentation well before filing even takes place. So for African and MENA investors, the source of funds complexity is not really a weakness. It's a reality. Families should assume that every transaction, every transfer, and every business relationship needs to be explained in plain chronological terms. So when this is done early, consular interviews become a conformality rather than an investigatory effort. Secondly, families should really proactively review their travel history, their prior visa refusals, if that's even an instance, and even passports and records. These issues that disproportionately affect applicants from certain African and MENA jurisdictions can trigger administrative processing if not addressed upfront. Thirdly, the realistic country-specific consular planning matters, where local consulates face backlogs or heightened scrutiny. Early legal strategy can include preparing clients for interview dynamics, documentation presentation, and timing expectations. A lot of families who face the fewest surprises are those who approach EB-5 like a regulatory process, not a transaction. So in this instance, my takeaway would be that early discipline preparation doesn't just reduce delays, it often shifts the power dynamics. Well-prepared families walk into consular processing informed, confident, and very much in control of the narrative.
Thank you. Musa, coming to you, are you seeing people from the Africa and the MENA region nationals who are already in the US look at EB-5 in the last couple of years?
Yes. So we have seen different. Right now, the shift that I have seen is mostly parents making investment for their kids. Sometimes they just don't want the kids to be back and facing possible denial of their visa renewal. So in those instances, they will just make an EB-5 investment while the kid is schooling in the US or in a different type of visa. So they will be able to adjust their status and remain in the United States.
What are the biggest planning mistakes that are made by investors when they wait for this process to get done? And in your experience, what is it that you advise them to do differently so that they don't incur these challenges?
It's about rushing things. So usually I can just go by example of experience that I've had in the past. I've had a client who made an EB-5 investment, and unfortunately he was not well advised by his counsel and sold his home and moved his entire family into the United States. So he just jumped on the plane, grabbed everyone, and they stopped schooling in Nigeria, and they flew into Atlanta. They stayed in Atlanta for almost 6 months, and the dad realized that, okay, we are going to be overstaying because our visa is no longer going to be current. And he realized that it was a big mistake. Unfortunately, he didn't tell me before he made that jump. And I don't know if he had checked with his counsel before making that shift. But yes, I would say that it takes a little bit of time, and it asks for a lot of patience. So it's not something that you are going to be rushing into. So take your time, work with your advisors, and make the solution that works properly. Do not rush things.
Thank you, Aisha, Nofi, and Musa. I think this definitely sets expectations clearly. Moving on to the next segment, let's try and dive deep into understanding what are the changes that have come in post the introduction of the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act of 2022. Aisha, this question's for you. From a legal standpoint, how has the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act changed US CIS adjudication and compliance expectations?
So, one primary way that the Act changed the adjudication process is, of course, the introduction of the set-aside categories for rural, high employment, and infrastructure projects. The Immigration Service is prioritizing those cases in practice, especially in the rural project area where there's 20% of the visas are set aside for this category. And this really allows for more transparency and predictability in processing times. I mean, right now we're seeing some cases approved in under 6 months. In addition, a really important part of the RIA was enhanced protections for investors. One of its primary goals was to provide greater integrity and transparency into the program. And it did this in a few different ways. One was increasing program compliance of regional centers. So focusing on more formalized rules, including disclosure reporting, audit checks, site visits, et cetera, really to ensure that the integrity standards are met. The second, on the investor side, is increased scrutiny of the source of funds documentation, requiring investors to prove the lawfulness of their funds from origination all the way through to investment through extensive documentation that must be clear and comprehensive. This is probably one of the most labor-intensive parts of the application process. Everything must be traceable. That said, the Act created structure, predictability, and consistency, and in addition, streamlined adjudication processes because there are efficiencies that have been added. For example, by mandating regional centers file for the pre-approval of the investment project through the I-956F, it's really streamlined the review of individual EB-5 applications, and that's resulting in better processing times and approval rates. You know, it's funny, Akshat, I recently came across a report on adjudication data released by the Immigration Service citing only a 3% denial rate in
Yes.
EB-5 petitions since the passage of the Act. You saw that as well.
Yes.
And it's really demonstrating its impact, right, on reducing adjudication risk. Now, one really important thing to keep in mind, however, as we all know, is that the passage of the Act, the Regional Center Program is authorized through September 30th of 2027. But the grandfathering protection ends a full year earlier. So what this means is that petitions must be filed on or before September 30th of this year to guarantee protections underneath the grandfathering provision. If that doesn't happen, investors could be exposed to program lapses, new rules, increased investment thresholds. So if you're considering the EB-5 process, timing is really important and of the essence right now.
Absolutely. I think I completely agree with you. Are you observing any notable trends in the form of RFEs or adjudication that investors from the African and the MENA region should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, the number one request for evidence or RFE trigger is insufficient or unclear documentation on the source and the path of the funds. So it's not just that they're lawful, it's demonstrating and documenting how they were earned, how they were transferred. And you need to, again, be able to trace those funds from origin to investment. And that can be challenging in cash-based economies, right? There could be documents that are difficult to obtain or simply unavailable, and that can present a gap in the source of funds narrative. It's really important to identify those gaps early on, work with counsel, try to close them through secondary documentation to minimize the risk and ensure you have corroborating evidence for every piece of the puzzle.
Right. How important, in your opinion, is basically documentation quality and legal structuring as early as possible, given the current EB-5 environment?
It's critical. The documentation quality is everything. The Immigration Service relies on that to corroborate the narrative of the source and the path of the funds. So you should be working with a team who's performing a forensic analysis of the documentation, again, ensuring there are no gaps. If you're missing paperwork or you're missing formal documentation, you should raise that early so that you can work together with your team of counsel to explore alternative recommendations to ensure viability of the case.
Sure. From an immigration attorney perspective, what signals would you recommend investors to look for when they're evaluating a project to understand if it's compliant or not?
Yeah, I mean, first thing to state the obvious, of course, is track record of success. You want to see a track record of success to give you comfort, right? So that's where we'll start. The second thing is ensuring that the project has already been approved by the Immigration Service, or at least that it's been filed and pending. Looking for high job creation cushion, not just the minimum of the 10. You want to look for a little bit of excess of that to give you that security. And then ensuring that the filing is thorough and detailed, not just hastily put together and assembled. And I think one really key piece of this too is if documentation is unavailable, the strategy should not be, let's file and see if we get an RFE, right?
Yeah.
And I hear that often. The strategy should be, let's proactively address this to avoid an RFE.
Sure. Moussa, coming to you, right? What makes a project EB-5 eligible? Aisha spoke about the minimum 10 jobs requirement. How critical is that? And why have investors mostly from this region relied on the regional center program?
So, as Aisha mentioned, job creation is the most essential point if you are doing an EB-5, because without job creation, there is no EB-5.
Yes.
So, to my opinion, EB-5 is not an investment. It's a job creation program. If you don't create the jobs, you don't get the residency. It's that simple. You can get the first phase of your petition approved, but if the project is not built, the second phase of your application is going to be denied, unfortunately. So it's critical to work with a regional center that has a good track record so you can have the project built and look at the collateral. So if the collaterals are just vague, it's not good. Make sure that your investment is going to create the jobs. That's the most important part, in my opinion.
Coming to the next question, which is, I mean, I think you're picking up my brains, because my next question was, what are the most common red flags that you see when it comes to just pure marketing material that investors fall for?
Unfortunately, we are in an industry that also includes bad players. So everyone is running for the capital of the investors. Some bad players will try to get the investors without actually trying to see if without putting a project that will be fit for EB-5, but their goal is just to get the capital of those investors. So make sure that you're investing into a project that you know that has been filed,
Yes,
as Aisha mentioned, or has received an approval of their initial petition, the I-956F. It's very important.
Nafi, for you, for families considering EB-5 in the next 9-12 months, what preparatory steps should they be taking now?
Yeah, so for families focused on stability and education, EB-5 should really be approached as a long-term family strategy, not a short-term investment. I'd say the first step is to understand that there's clarity on your priorities, schooling, healthcare, and future mobility. The second would be structuring the investment and your documentation to minimize surprises and maximize compliance and confidence. Families should also think sequentially. They should maintain schooling and employment while the EB-5 process runs. They should also prepare for contingencies, whether that's in the visa timeline, and also consider that U.S. moves are the culmination of careful planning. It is not a starting point. And finally, they should really select projects and regional centers based on regulatory transparency, as well as the historical compliance, rather than financial returns alone. When they do this, this will ensure that there is alignment with both immigration and family goals.
Moussa, for investors who are starting in the next 30 days, what would be the best sequential order to begin the EB-5 process?
Start talking to an immigration lawyer. Prepare your documents, and make sure to file your petition before September 30, 2026. I'm not talking about making the investment. Yes. Make the investment, but file your petition. Yes. It is really critical. At U.S. Immigration Fund, we also will allow you to make an investment starting at $200,000 and come up with the balance as you go. But make sure to get that petition filed. It's very important.
Nofi, what would you say to investors who've been on the fence due to uncertainty or misleading information in the market?
So when I think about this question, I think about this in the sense, what would be the most important consideration for my African or my MENA clientele? And mainly, it's that individuals need to start thinking about planning, not when it's time to file, but at least 12 to 18 months prior to filing. So for families planning to start the EB-5, let's say in the next year or so, the most important work begins now. It's important to think about how you should be preparing for that EB-5 process, not just the paperwork, but speaking to regional centers, speaking to your counsel, and making sure that you're aligning your intention to file with what's actually happening behind the scenes, your preparation, your paperwork.
Moussa, for investors who are interested but delaying because of lack of clarity, what would be your advice to them before we conclude?
I would recommend that choose a regional center that first has the expertise. And if they allow you to make a sequential investment, you can start by making an investment of a certain sum. Let's say in our case, for example, we allow you to make an investment of $200,000 and come up with the balance in a short period of time. So work with the regional center that you know is qualified to make a successful petition for you, and also work with a good immigration partner so everything will be filed on time.
Aisha, Nofi, Moussa, thank you so much for taking out the time today. For the interest of our audience, the collective audience here brings about over 50 years of EB-5 experience in totality. I'm really, really grateful to you all for joining. Aisha, especially to you, thank you so much for joining us from all the way from New York, a city, as I said, I really love, and I hope to see you very soon. On that note, for the interest of our audience, I hope that this podcast was helpful and it created value. We thank you all for your time, and we hope to see you in the next episode of EB-5 Essentials.